Remember that God has given us this great instrument, and we must use it, like it or not. We're going to be using it. And we're constantly tasked with saying to people, how are you forming your conscience? What are you putting in? Is it only garbage in and garbage out? Or are you willing to engage in that great human activity of deciding? It's said that when John Paul II would go canoeing as a priest and even as a bishop with so many of his young friends, he would take time and take everyone aside. It was a sort of a classic joke. Sooner or later on the canoe trip, you're going to get taken aside by Uncle Lolek, as they called him affectionately. You get taken aside and he talked about, what are you going to do with your life? What are you going to be? What are you going to do with this, that, or the other? And the last question, the last statement was always, now you must decide. And that's true. But we don't want to decide in our time and in our society. Isn't that the case? We want to put off certain types of maturity. We want to put off commitments. The big C is not cancer, my friends. The big C is commitment, right? And we must commit with conscience. So that's why it's relevant in our day, because especially when it comes to this whole area of life and love, of sexuality, of the choices of whether we open ourselves to the possibility of children, then we must commit. And, you know, there are ways to try to get out of it, but they're brutal ways. We know that. And so the difficulty about conscience is that conscience is incessant. It's incessant. And it means, I believe, that we can appeal to conscience. We can appeal to conscience to say, what actually is truth? And what is holding you back from being able to know what truth really is? And it's true, of course, that in our time, we often have a big fight for truth. People say, it's your truth, it's my truth. What is truth? Oh, that's a familiar quote, you know. And the problem of it is to say, well, what is truth? Truth is something that can be known, and it's something we have to be able to seek. And I believe it's one of the great battles of our time is for even the very possibility and existence of truth. And regardless of where people are coming from, that's one thing you can always talk about. The French philosophers, the deconstructionists, well, they're dead now. And the reality is that their philosophy will soon die in the ashes with them. But for ourselves, truth is something that is incessant and definite and something that will resonate in our time. Secondly, I believe that we are people that are called to be able to form a conscious culture, a conscious culture. One of the great philosophers, I think, of our time is a guy called Alistair MacIntyre. And he says in the end of probably his most seminal book, After Virtue, the very last page, a page that jumped out at me at the election of St. Benedict, or Pope Benedict, that's a Freudian slip. And it goes like this, I'll paraphrase. He said, it's always dangerous to draw too strict or definite a parallel between one historical age and another. However, we can learn from history sometimes. And he said, if you look at the end of the Roman Empire, the people did not know that it was the end of the Roman Empire. And they slogged along, and they probably thought that they were keeping the Roman Imperium going, but they weren't. In actuality, they were forming new and very different types of human living and Christian community. And he said the same thing is true in our day, that we too are seeing the end of one culture, the culture that ended in the middle of the 20th century, and we thought we were holding it on. You want to call it the fact that we live in a postmodern culture? Perhaps that's true. But the reality is that between them and us, there's one big difference. There, the barbarians were at the gates. For us, they've been ruling us for quite some time. And we are waiting, MacIntyre said, doubtless not for another Trotsky or another Godot, but for a new and doubtless very different St. Benedict. I remember sitting at CTV in the TV studios when the announcer basically came out onto the balcony and announced, we have a pope, and his name is, and he's chosen Benedict. And I just came to mind because consciously he took that name. He took that name from Saint Benedict, who was the founder of monasticism, and we often think one of the saviors of Western civilization, but also from Pope Benedict, who during and at the end of the First World War fought valiantly to be able to truly have a Christian culture. And that's what we do. We are called not to take it for granted anymore. We're not taking it for granted. You must consciously build a culture. And to build a culture is complex. But building a culture doesn't happen from the top. It isn't a question just of your museums. Culture is built from the bottom, like any good edifice. It is built with a strong foundation. It is built by making conscious, hard choices, and it is built by linking together like-minded people so that we form first networks, then communities, and then that civilization of life and love. That's how it is built up. And we ourselves are called to be able to do that, and we're called to be able to recognize some hard facts. Every time I see statistics about Catholics, I say, what a bunch of junk. Because the real statistics for Catholics are the ones that practice their faith and the ones that are just baptized. Okay? The ones that practice their faith, we're an odd bunch. We really are. We stand out. We're an awful lot closer to the evangelicals than to almost anybody else. I don't know if you know that or not, but it's true. And it's strange things that have happened in our time. I can remember being involved in Operation Rescue a number of years ago and being thrown in jail with evangelicals. And, you know, we teach them to say the rosary and they teach us how to sing. And who would have ever thought that evangelicals and so-called, quote, Orthodox Catholics would ever get along? But we found out that in this mystery of God's plan, we have an awful lot in common. An awful lot in common. And we have a lot in common with other people. A few years ago, I was at the University of Toronto in Mississauga, and myself and a Muslim professor were debating the Raelians. I don't know if you remember the Raelians. The Raelian, Rael, is a French-Canadian guy who decided that he was basically like sort of an incarnation of a type of gods, and the gods came from other planets, and he had a whole new religion. And they said that they cloned a human being. Do you remember this a number of years ago? Anyway, so his bishop was there, Bridget, and him. And so anyway, I turned to this Muslim professor from the University of Western Ontario, and I said, Ali, tonight it's the believers against the non-believers. He said, you're on. And that's true. That within this culture, within this conscious culture, we are called to be able to form whole different bonds. And I believe that because this buried treasure that we celebrate today speaks to the very heart of what it means to be human, that is something that we have as a language between individuals, one to another. It is not some kind of treasure that we hold only to ourselves, but it's a treasure, as it says in another place in Scripture, that is like pressed down in your lap and flowing over. That's what it means to be able to have a conscious culture. Thirdly, I believe that we need to be able to recognize that Humanae Vitae is relevant because we need to be able to recapture sexuality as wonder. We need to be able to say that sexuality is not something which is just plumbing. That's not the way it works. Sexuality is wonder because, in effect, we can never be able to dissect sexuality. In a way, we can only know the geography of sexuality. And in geography, you only touch, in some ways, on the surface. It takes a great deal of work to be able to recognize that we hold on to that wonder of what it means to be able to share in the life of another person, and to be able to share in the life of another person in such a total way that that trust that I desperately want, that I desperately seek, can be found and reciprocated. And that it can be found in such a way that I don't have to wonder, you know, if I'm using up my time on the parking ticket. It doesn't have to be wondered and shared. It's just a matter that we share it with ourselves so totally and completely that I believe that it's something that will actually fulfill me.